Hello and welcome to the first episode of CMQ's, the Scottish Sun's politics show, following on from the roaring success, of course, of our general election series, where we brought you phenomenal interviews with the likes of Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader. You'll get more of that stuff over the coming weeks, where we'll bring you updates and discussion on the biggest stories affecting Holyrood and Westminster, as well as guests and quickfire interviews, hopefully with our favourite buzzer toy that we used with Anas Sarwar. My name's Conor Matchett, I'm political editor at the Scottish Sun, and here with me, as I think is going to be every single week, hopefully, unless you're off, skiving, is associate editor of the paper, Chris Musson. We're going to kick off today by bringing you up to speed with what's gone on in the first kind of days back from Scottish politics' summer snooze fest. And there's only one place that we can really start, and that is in the Edinburgh International Conference Centre at the weekend, SNP's annual conference, which was an event. Chris, you were there on Sunday, I was there all 3 days.
Yeah.
What was the general vibe? And be nice about it, because it's quite hard to think of anything nice about it.
Yeah, well, this conference was obviously intended to be in the run-up to the general election, when everyone thought it was going to be in October. So the SNP scheduled it for the end of August, thinking, right, we'll have this and then we'll go into the election campaign and everything will be booming. But of course, the SNP got absolutely hammered in July in the earlier than expected election. And yeah, it was a pretty dismal affair. As you say, I arrived on Sunday morning, but you'd been keeping me filled in over the weekend. And it was low key is probably an understatement. I think I said in my column at the weekend, we're not quite at the stage of funeral comparisons yet, but it's clear
not far away.
Something has died in the SNP, and the place was, half empty.
It was one of those sorts of conferences where you walk in and you get the sense that the vast amount of people there are there out of a sense of duty rather than in a sense of, it's such a far cry away from those conferences post-referendum where there's almost this festival atmosphere around the SNP.
Yeah.
Instead you have glum, usually older faces from, the battle-hardened activists of 30 years walking through. Very few young people about, very few MSPs and MPs, obviously, after the general election result. But just that kind of, they know they're in trouble, I think, and it wasn't fun for anyone.
No, we said in our conference diary earlier this week that one former MP had said to us that they were only there because the hotel room, they couldn't cancel it, And you talked about the age profile. It seemed to be back to the older members of the SNP, the people you would see pre-2014. It was a very grey audience. The young guys in sharp suits, there were still a few of them, but there weren't the hordes that we've seen at conferences in the last 10 years. I think Kevin McKenna, in his column earlier this week, sort of referred to them as the Matalan crew.
Yeah.
And they're all gone, basically, or most of them are gone, which is, perhaps say something about the commitment of that younger generation of SNP followers and how they sort of disappeared. Now they're in times of trouble. Absolutely.
And the kind of big ticket event, other than John Swinney's speech, which we'll come to in a minute, was this post-election post-mortem from SNP members. Now, this was held behind closed doors, but we got some inside lines about what was discussed. Yeah. Obviously, the SNP collapsed from 48 MPs to 9 in July's general election, a proper drubbing, one of their worst results and worst reverses. I think it's probably their worst result in history in terms of what they went from to and what they ended up with. Interesting, though, that wasn't quite as damaging as it could have been. The kind of main threads that we heard from it was 250,000 votes lost to Labour, people earning over the kind of mid-£20,000 of income switching in their droves to Anas Sarwar's party. But there wasn't that kind of bitter infighting that we kind of really expected. It was very carefully stage managed.
It was incredibly carefully stage managed from what we hear. I spoke to somebody who was in the room and they talked about how the whole session, which lasted, I think, 2.5 hours, is that right?
Yeah.
Was very, very choreographed to the extent that they thought it was designed to essentially sap the energy from the room before people actually got questions. So you had a big presentation on polling from the former MSP Marco Biaggi, and you had John Swinney speak, and you had one of the national officials speak as well. But this was all very, very drawn out. And, you know, from what we were hearing, it's kind of like everyone was just like falling asleep by the time they got to the questions. And then some of the questions were kind of cut off. I think the very first question was a question about or related to Operation Branchford, the police's investigation into SNP finances, and that, you know, that got very short shrift from the stage. So there maybe weren't that many fireworks, but it was clearly very stage managed.
Absolutely. And then John Swinney had his big conference speech, his first as SNP leader, Mark II. Obviously, he'll have had a few in the early 2000s as well. And his advisors were obviously going around beforehand, talking it up or not, as the case may be, because I think what someone said to me was it'd be lots of rhetoric and it will make you cry. I think in reality it sent everyone to sleep. There was absolutely nothing in it.
Well, every conference where it's a party of government, all the political hacks are like, right, what's the announcement going to be? And there's always an announcement. Sometimes it's trailed, sometimes it's in the speech, you know, so there's usually multiple announcements, and usually announcements where they dress up old stuff as new as well. But there was nothing, and they made quite clear before the speech, there's not going to be an announcement. This isn't the time for announcements. It's like, all right, we can't make announcements because, you know, it'll look terrible optics because there's going to be big cuts coming up next week and blah, blah, blah. It's like...
And we have to do it in front of Parliament first as well.
Yeah, well, I just don't understand the logic of that. No. I mean, you can't just give up, right? And it looked like Swinney had sort of was going through the motions, not necessarily that he'd given up, but he was very much going through the motions with his speech, and it had very, very little to offer. And of course, the hall was like nearly half empty or half full, whichever way you want to look at it. But it was not a good look, and it does not look like a party on the up, that's for sure.
No, and we'll move on, you know, following on from that thrill ride that was SNP conference, straight into Holyrood. Holyrood back on Tuesday this week after the summer recess, and we kicked it off with a hefty statement from the Finance Secretary, Shona Robertson, where she outlined £1 billion worth of savings, as Scottish Government insiders like to call them, rather than cuts. There's savings. Don't really know the difference, but there we go. And that covered, you know, 188 million from frontline public services, included 100 million pounds from emergency spending controls, and we have other things as well. And the big thing that many people picked up on was this raid of the one-off wind energy bonanza that is ScotWind, for those who don't know. And that was about 750 million pounds that was taken from big energy giants for the rights essentially to build offshore wind farms.
Selling off the seabed. Or renting it.
And that cash is going to be used to cover the day-to-day spending and these big public sector deals. What did you make of that? Because it's a hefty old amount of money, and it feels completely self-inflicted.
Well, and it was Connor here who wrote a story back in January revealing that, like, for the last financial year, they were planning, although they didn't, actually to dip into this ScotWind pot, this one-off pot. And that's the point here. This is a one-off pot of money. And it was intended to be spent on, you know, the transition to renewable energy, because it's a huge lump sum. But it's a one-off pot. So if they spend that on wages this year, which they're planning on doing, those wage costs don't go away. They're still here next year. The pot, it's gone. So what do? So it is, as has been pointed out by various people, kicking the can down the road. So it's spending this pot of wealth, which, you know, you could argue is a little bit hypocritical given the SNP preaching over the years about the UK government spending oil money and not squirreling it away. You know, they're doing pretty much the same here now, but what they do next year, basically they've got to come back and do more cuts. And
in reality, I mean, this £460 million is, you know, as you mentioned, last year they'd committed 310 million to spend on ScotWind, which they ended up using none of.
Yeah.
In reality, that 460 million is to get them to the October budget from Rachel Reeves in London, in the hope that Labour turn around and say, actually, we weren't telling the full truth about these £22 billion of cuts. Here's a whole bunch of money, and Shona Robertson will breathe a sigh of relief ahead of December.
Yeah, she'll breathe a sigh of relief and say that, even if they do get some extra money from the UK government, they'll say this is down to great financial planning and prudent management of the finances by the Scottish government. So they're buying themselves a bit of time there. So we'll have to wait and see what happens in the UK budget at the end of October. But that list of cuts, we still don't know exactly where these cuts are going to fall. There's more than 100 million from the health and social care budget, and it's not really transparent where that is coming from yet. Yeah. I'm sure these bits of details will come out over the coming weeks when, they start dipping into these parts of the budget and we start finding out what actual frontline services are being hit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's move on to yesterday's big ticket item, which is John Swinney's programme for government. This is when a First Minister gets a chance to outline their plans for the year. It's effectively the King's Speech for Holyrood. It was all a bit of a damp squib.
Yeah. Now, again, like his conference speech, this was not an attractive affair. It was really, really grim, really, really dull, and an incredibly robotic speech. Now, John Swinney's a nice fella, but it doesn't look like his heart is in this. And I don't understand what the SNP are doing here at the moment. Now, they're not offering any hope. They've spent the last couple of weeks slagging off Labour for, the glumness happening down south. And they've come back in the first week of Parliament and presented nothing but misery. This sort of scaled back programme for government where he's cut various things, including his pledge back in 2020 to deliver free school meals for all primary kids. That's gone. It's just miserable. And this guy is a new First Minister. And as he said in his speech yesterday, he was so proud to be doing his first speech, programme for government speech as First Minister. And is this really what he wanted to do?
Well, Douglas Ross nailed him, didn't he? I mean, we won't touch much on the Scottish Tory leadership campaign.
What's one for another time?
It's ongoing, don't worry. But Douglas Ross, still in his acting role as leader, stood up and went, is this really, after 25 years of waiting, John Swinney, someone who's been a massive part of the SNP independence movement, is this really all you were waiting for after 25 years? Absolutely nailed it, didn't he?
No, absolutely. Yeah, say what you want about Douglas Ross, and we've said lots of pretty unpleasant things. That was a good line. And you've got to wonder what's going on here. The SNP are in this bind where there's no obvious successor, or rather one of the obvious successors, Stephen Flynn's at Westminster, so it can't be him. And Kate Forbes, the other one, half the party hater. So, or at least the MSPs. So they're in this bind, and it looks like they've got nowhere to go. And to me, it looks like they're pretending Swinney is a man for the future when he's blatantly the guy from the past.
Absolutely.
And Swinney's heart doesn't look in it, because if it were, then he would have been coming out buzzing with ideas. Yeah, okay, we've not got all the money in the world, but that's not, politics isn't just about money and blowing money. It's about big ideas and reform and, policy. And we're not seeing very much from him, which to me suggests that they're scrabbling around behind the scenes, perhaps looking for a way to get somebody in for a decent run before the Holyrood election.
That's probably potentially one for another time, but I think it's worth focusing briefly, because we're running out of time, just on the kind of big ambition of John Swinney in this programme for government. This was spun away yesterday, by Scottish Government advisors as, we basically, in this job, you often go to talk to these people and you go, there's nothing in this, give us your best shot, try and convince us that this is important. And the response was, well, this is an incredibly ambitious programme for government because we're going to eradicate child poverty, and no one's ever said that before, which is the most meaningless commitment if you don't have a number or a date to do it by. And this is a common thread among SNP leaders.
Well, it is. I mean, we're going to eradicate child poverty. So what does eradicate mean? It means completely wipe it out. I mean, this is just bananas. It's nonsense. It's not going to happen. They are not going to wipe out child poverty in its entirety. Maybe they'll find some way to argue statistically that they have. But the idea that there won't be poor kids in Scotland it's
for the birds.
It's for the birds, you know. He might as well promise that he's going to take the SNP on an away day on a like Edinburgh sightseeing bus around the moon, do loop-the-loops. I don't know. It's just mad. But it's just another one of this formula that the SNP have had over the past decade of just promising the world and dining out on the promises. You know, cutting NHS waiting lists, like reducing class sizes. In fact, that one goes back to 2007, like eliminating the educational attainment gap, like abolishing the council tax, which goes back to 2007 as well, and of course has been shelved again in this week's programme for government. This formula of dining out on the promises, which of course is all that John Swinney's known.
Yeah.
He just seems to sort of be continuing with this and eradicating child poverty. And it's an honourable aim. Don't get me wrong, it's an honourable aim. Of course it is. But how are you going to do it? Because he's not told us. He's not produced detailed plans. So what are we to take from that?
Absolutely. Well, that's all we've got time for this week. We'll be back, I'm sure, soon with the next big story from Holyrood and or Westminster, depending on whether or not the 9 SNP MPs can make any sort of dent down south. But thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much at home as well. Goodbye.